right, my gorgeous people. So today we're going to continue on with our chapter 14, which is on evaluation and monitoring. Few slides to go, so we're good. All right, so how will you measure it? That's what we're looking at. And it says, so when you're choosing your primary technique for measuring outcome is a crucial step in evaluating planning. So techniques like keeping records, outputs, and keeping records of outputs and outcomes allows evaluation to document tangible evidence of change. So for example, tracking numbers of recycled material collected can be quantifiable insight into the effectiveness of recycling campaign. So the recycling campaign may not be something that you can quantify, but you could probably quantify the output of it, right? Which is, or the outcome of it. How many cans has the recycling facility added that they wouldn't normally have? Does that make sense? So records, so there's a difference between records, output, and outcome. Records are documents, document-specific actions taken, so such as the number of outreach events conducted. Okay, how many events have you put on? What are the things that you did at those events? Those are records. Outputs outputs measure the immediate results, such as the attendance at an event. An outcome, on the other hand, assesses long-term impacts such as sustainable behavioral change. So those are the difference between the three. Evaluators must also consider the limitations of the chosen technique. So for example, relying solely on participation data may overlook qualitative insight into participants' experiences or motivation. So you have to combine your quantitative and qualitative methods in order to actually have something that is good. So with that said, it's a good segue to quantitative surveys. And quantitative and qualitative surveys are actually a very common tool for measuring campaign outputs. Quantitative surveys provide numerical data to be analyzed systematically or statistically, and you're looking at things like percentages, you're looking at things of how many or ratios or things of that sort. Whereas when you talk about qualitative measurement, you're looking at feelings and emotions and sentiments that offer, or motivation that offer, a deeper insight into the participant's behavior. And then you have, you can measure this through non-randomized control groups. And these are alternatives when you cannot do randomized control groups, when that is outside of your budget or scope or whatever, or outside of your feasibility. And so they are a little less rigorous and they may have more room for bias, but they're also a really good way to provide comparative data. So let's say you are recycling, or you're comparing recycling rates in neighborhoods with and without access to the campaign material. It can highlight the campaign's impact, okay? So it might not be randomized groups that you're selecting from these neighborhoods, but just merely going out and conducting these researches in the two neighborhoods, you are able to collect that data and compare them. And of course, you can blend these all of these methods to get something that is really good. And I don't think we talked about non-randomized. I don't think we talked about randomized. Randomized are considered the gold standard of measuring effectiveness. And so by randomly assigning participants to intervention or control groups, you minimize the bias, okay? So there's like a process where there's a randomized selection of, instead of me saying, so-and-so in this class is going to be a representative of this class, I'll put all of your names in a bowl and I'll pick one that is a randomized choice, okay? So within that, how will you measure? We're looking at observation research, and these are scientific surveys and database records are good for collecting data on campaign outputs. However, observation research involves systematically watching and recording behaviors or events, often in a natural setting. So literally what you're doing is observing. You're looking at someone or you're looking at a behavior and you are assessing something out of it. So for example, in a recycling initiative, evaluators might observe how people sort waste at a collection site. And this method provides real-time, unbiased data, offering insight into actual behavior rather than self-reported action. So people tend to forget things, especially if there's a distance in time. They'll tell you, oh, I do X, Y, and Z, but because there are nuances in what is being done, often things are forgotten or overlooked. With that said, you can then look at when you do observation, none of these details are forgotten. And so what you think is important and what the researcher thinks is important may be two different things, if that makes sense, right? So you would highlight the details that you think are relevant to the research, but you don't really know the details that are actually relevant, but the researcher does. And so by doing observations, they will look into the details that would not be otherwise. So scientific and technical surveys allow evaluators to gather structured data from large groups of participants. These surveys often include standardized questions, ensuring consistency in response so that everyone that's out there is asked the same series of questions, which means that as you're looking at the responses, there's only one factor that's changing, and that's the response. The question itself is still the same, and that makes it less likely that it is influenced by the question rather than both of them changing. Hope that makes sense. All right, then we have records and databases, and records and databases provide historical and contextual data that can enrich evaluations. So for example, accessing municipal waste collection records might help determine whether a recycling campaign resulted in a measurable reduction in landfill contributions. And records also offer a way to track progress over time, helping evaluators access the campaign's long-term impact. So the idea is records, people forget things, as we talked about earlier, records don't. Okay, so you can always go back to your records and say, okay, this is what actually happened. And so if you're going to replicate the campaign, you can. If you are going to look at the data and compare it, you can, and so forth. Comparative effective research and pilot studies are critical methods for evaluating the success of a campaign as well. So you're looking at comparative effective research, which evaluates different strategies or interventions to determine which one of the interventions is actually the most effective. And those are what you need to know. So for example, let's say you are doing an anti-idling campaign, like Turn It Off. So researchers might compare the effectiveness of educational workshops versus reminders in reducing vehicle idle times. Okay, so basically you're turning that vehicle off instead of it just sitting there idle. And so you're comparing the two. Which one is more effective? The timing of the measurement effort before, during, and after the campaign is implementation is really, really important for evaluating the success of your campaign and making data-driven adjustments. So the pre-campaign measurement involves establishing a baseline to understand the starting point. For example, in a campaign aimed at reducing plastic waste, pre-campaign metrics might measure the average amount of single-use plastic per consumed per household. So that is the pre. Then you have the during implementation. So as you are implementing that campaign, you find a way to evaluate it as well. And so you're collecting data to monitor the progress and to identify areas of improvement. And that would allow for real-time improvements rather than just waiting until the end to actually restructure it. Okay. Imagine going through a year's worth of campaign only to realize, oh, it didn't actually do what it was supposed to do. So you do the pre, you do the during, and of course, you do the post-campaign activities, and that would be assessing the overall impact and long-term sustainability of behavioral change. Okay. You have the baseline measure as well, and baseline measures are essential because they provide a clear starting point of assessing the product, of assessing the project. Word, 1 second. All right. So for example, Eat Your Greens study that they have, baseline data might capture participants' initial vegetable consumption patterns and attitudes towards healthy eating. And this data serves as a benchmark for measuring the campaign's success in changing environments or attitudes. So baseline are identify the gaps between the goals and make sure that there is a realistic goal that's being set. Without them, it would be challenging to determine whether the observed change is actually due to the campaign or it's due to something else. So you have to have that baseline before you start your measurements, but you have to understand what it is and how it functions. Okay. You also have to look at the costs of this campaign. And are there minimal costs, moderate costs, significant costs, and you have to make decisions about these costs as well. So you have to look, is it part of the budget that you have? Is it something that you could afford? What are the things that would be minimal? What are the things that you would be moderate in this campaign? And what are the things that cost the most? And your budget has to go there. And that is in terms of time, again, as well as resources. And you have to, as you're evaluating, or even before you start, you have to figure out these decisions about cost and how you are going to mitigate them. And finally, we have ethical considerations, and they ensure that the campaigns are conducted responsibly and transparently. And so the extent of measuring and reporting must strike a balance between obtaining meaningful data and respecting the participants' rights. And that, my friend, is it for this particular lecture. Any questions?